The state of affairs in South Africa is that it's actually, if you look at the funding and the budget allocation for mental health services in South Africa, it's very disproportionate. And in fact, in terms of health equity, we'll see that there's a higher health budget spend on general health needs and lesser amount focused on or spent on mental health needs. And if you look at it, and you just said that in your introduction, that mental health, and if you look specifically at the mental health and poverty study that was done, that neuropsychiatric conditions rank the third highest in South Africa as part of the burden of disease. And we are still finding, in fact, in the South African Medical Journal of 2010, it was clearly stated that there's significant barriers to financing and the development of mental health services. And this has resulted in, obviously, psychiatric hospitals remaining fairly outdated, particularly in some of the outlying rural communities, falling into disrepair, sometimes unfit actually for human use, a serious shortage of mental health professionals, inability to develop vitally important tertiary level psychiatric services such as child and adolescent services, community health and psychosocial rehabilitation services remaining underdeveloped, so that patients end up often in hospitals or untreated for that matter. And this is despite the fact that we have progressive piece of legislation in the Mental Health Care Act of 2002, and despite the fact that South Africa signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which has been ratified. So we find that in certain areas, particularly in the urban areas, you may obviously have access, but the more deep rural you go, the more sparse services become against that backdrop that I just sketched.
Professor Robertson, let me bring you in here, because I'm not sure if you're in a position to give us an idea of the prevalent forms of mental disorders in South Africa.
Yes, well, like everywhere else in the world, depression and anxiety are the commonest forms of mental disorder. It's been found that, for instance, 1 in 10 women will have depression in the course of their lifetime, and 1 in 25 men. So that's how common that is. Then there are other disorders which are much less common but often much more serious, like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and Alzheimer's dementia.
Let me pick up on the depression and anxiety, because, to be honest, Prof, I don't think a lot of us actually take those as mental disorders. In fact, we just, look at you and like, well, I mean, get over it, snap out of it.
Yes. Well, there are a range of levels of anxiety and depressive disorders. Many people would have mild anxiety or depression, which could resolve without treatment. The only risk there is that depression is a recurrent disorder, which means that it may resolve this time round without treatment, but you are at risk for recurrence again. So, and then when we talk about treatment, I'm not necessarily meaning medication. With certainly the milder and some of the moderate anxiety and depressive disorders, we can work with counseling. Counseling on its own is often enough. But once you get to the severe disorders, then you do need medication. And I hear what you're saying, that we don't seem to be aware that there's so much of this going around. But actually, if you work in the field, you do realize how much of it is, because people on the whole don't talk about their problems to other people that easily. And you'll be surprised how many people that you know have or will suffer from anxiety or depression.
How do I know that somebody has anxiety, for instance? How are they identifiable signs?
Anxiety is quite more difficult in a way to identify than depression. It's commoner than depression, and many of us do live with anxiety even when it becomes quite severe. The types of anxiety, for instance, one of the common types is people who worry excessively. And again, some of those people just accept that that's the way they are, and yet their excessive worry can cause tremendous problems for them, both in their own health, in their family relationships, and so on, but those are not addressed. And then in children, a very common form of anxiety is separation anxiety. And we see this in children where it builds up to the point that they don't feel they can go to school, what we sometimes call school refusal or school phobia. And that's often due to anxiety about being away from home. So those are two examples. There are many other kinds of anxiety disorders which you'll recognize the names of, like panic disorder, which is not common. There's obsessive-compulsive disorder, which is very severe, but fortunately not common. There's social anxiety, which again, I think we sometimes think of these people as just very shy, but social anxiety can be extremely handicapping to the point where a person may not want to leave the house and may not want to continue working because they can't operate among other people.
I know that you said, for instance, bipolar is not really that common, but I've come across a couple of people who can suffer extreme bipolar. To what extent is it common?
It's common. It only occurs in about 1.5% of the population. And I say only because anxiety and depression are 5 to 8% in the population, figures like that. So it's relatively less common.
You spoke about children as well, Professor.
Yes.
There's an SMS here from Lyndon Bloemfontein who says, there are no services for children with autism. People end up in general institutions, mostly private and extremely expensive. Just over and above autism, of course, ADD and all of those, not very much known in our societies.
Yes, well, it is changing rapidly. And certainly ADHD, I think, is becoming very well known. The trouble is that sometimes now parents and teachers think that every child who's behaving a little bit differently has ADHD, which could be a problem. Autism is not common. It's a relatively uncommon disease, although it seems to have become commoner in recent times, and there are various theories about why that is. And yes, it's true that there are not sufficient facilities countrywide for autistic children.
Just picking up on the autistic children, then what are the symptoms here? How will I know that my child perhaps may be suffering from autism?
Well, the symptoms, the classical symptoms of autism, which appear before the age of 3, and these are children who basically don't relate normally to other children, so that they aren't able to play with other children. Sometimes the disturbances to the point where they don't recognize their own name, even their parents. If their parents call them, they don't recognize their name. They often avoid affection, so they don't want hugs, to be hugged by the parents or to be close to anybody. And they develop some sort of language problems. Worse, in some autistic children never speak at all. Others do talk, but the communication is never quite a normal kind of communication. And then finally, they sometimes have some odd habits like they twirl on their toes or they play for hours with a little piece of string. So those would be the symptoms of the classical autism. Then but autism is part of a spectrum, and there's a lot of focus now on milder manifestations of the autistic spectrum. And you may have heard the term Asperger's disorder, which is commoner than autism. And these are cases where there's no language disorder, and these children can talk normally and therefore often can go to school and learn normally, but their relationship with other people is not normal. Again, I just want to express a word of concern because I've seen so many children nowadays who have their own individual way of reacting, or they're under stress, or there's a problem, being labeled Asperger's when they're not Asperger's disorder. But that is perhaps the main thing I want to say about autism spectrum disorders.
Let me quickly, though, also welcome on the line now Dr. Gwen Ramokgopa. Effectively, what then we have here, Dr. Ramokgopa, is that the professor is outlining some of the mental disorders that are there in society. But again, questions are being asked, both on SMS and, of course, also people have been sending us emails. The treatment, do we have services that are dealing with these kind of mental disorders in society?
Mental health is not separate from physical health. We need to also take the stigma out of it. The second issue is whether South Africa has laws and policies. Yes, we do. There is a National Mental Health Act that was passed in, I think something 2003 3, 4 around that time, which we are revising already. I think before the end of this financial year, which is next year, March, we would have presented that at a summit, which will have a national summit. We also have, we do regular surveys. We have done a national psychiatric epidemiological survey that also looks at stress levels and mental health surveys. So we do all these things. In terms of services, the Mental Health Act instructs that firstly there must be recognition of mental health as a human right issue. Secondly, that there should be services provided to promote mental health as a start. Like, for instance, now we have about 9% of all injuries related to suicides, especially amongst youth, contribute to about 9% of all injuries. So we need to look at preventative interventions in that regard. We also have introduced, over and above the hospitals, the specialized hospitals, we've introduced services in each and every hospital facility for observation, that people must be observed for about 72 hours before they are transferred to the specialized mental hospitals, because this specialized mental hospital used to be overcrowded. But above all, we've also introduced mental health services at the primary health care, at the clinic level. And the program of increasing the life expectancy of South Africans, because our focus is not only on death rates, it's also on the quality of life. As we say, long and healthy life for South Africans includes also combating mental health disorders.